Namaskar. Welcome to this session. We are considering the third phase of kleshas called raga, conveniently rendered as attachment. Now, Patanjali very aptly describes this raga as sukhanushayi. It is only after experience of sukha, after experience of sukham, that this klesha comes up. So it immediately follows experience of happiness, experience of delight, experience of pleasure, experience of sukham. Because we don't just experience sukham, but we want it to be coming repeatedly, coming that very often, and coming that in a bigger volume as well. So once we experience sukham, what is called as pleasure or delight or happiness, we want that to repeat it. We don't just want to have it once and then we say enough. We want that to be repeated, we want that to come frequently, we want that to be experienced in a greater magnitude as well. We don't want it to be diminishing. And when it is in a diminishing form, then we don't deem it as happiness. Reduced happiness is not happiness, reduced happiness is sorrow. So we should understand how human psyche interprets the experience such as sukham, experience such as pleasure, experience such as delight and happiness. So, what is resulting out of experience of happiness or pleasure or delight or sukham is referred to here as a klesha. It is klesha. Sukham is not a klesha. This should be understood here. What is referred to is not happiness as a klesha, delight as a klesha, sukham as a klesha, but what immediately, unexceptionally follows it has been referred to as klesha. So, the point to be noted here that whenever we have a sukhanubhava or experience of sukham, we start developing attachment to that sukham. We start developing attachment, fondness, craving for that sukham. It doesn't end with just experience of it. But then there is what is called as sukhasanga. Sukhasanga means attachment to pleasure, attachment to experience of pleasure. And therefore, it should be understood that if somebody doesn't have experience of a particular sukham or sukham at all, then there won't be attachment coming up. If we never experience any kind of delight and pleasure, then we will not develop this klesha. But once any kind of sukham, any kind of pleasure, any kind of delight, any kind of happiness is once experienced, then there will be something that is called as sukha sanga. And we will be expecting that to return more often, very often, that too in a greater magnitude. So it gives rise to sukhecha. And that sukhecha is klesha. Sukham is not a klesha, but sukhecha is klesha. Pleasure or delight is not a klesha, but desire for pleasures, desire for happiness is referred to here as klesha or affliction. Now, if the desire for sukham is great, If the desire for any sukha or delight or pleasure is great, then we know that in human psyche, one ends up doing anything for it. Absolutely anything will be done to get the sukham. So philosophically, sukhecha, the desire for pleasure, desire for delight, desire for happiness, will create eclipse to what is called as buddhi. So consequently, there will be karya avivekam, indiscrimination between the do's and don'ts, because the vasana for the pleasure or pleasure seeking is so strong that, as I have been telling you repeatedly, we try to get it by hook or crook. So that is absence of discrimination for do's and don'ts. Karma avivekam. So there is eclipse to karma viveka, eclipse of karya viveka. It becomes weaker or even it goes away. It is not there, or at least it becomes weak. Now once we lose this discrimination between do's and don'ts, right and wrong, then you can see that it is going to be an affliction. It is therefore called klesha, because the viveka is going to get eclipsed, partially or even completely. Any kind of viveka, dharma ki viveka, karya viveka, papa punya viveka, karma viveka, all kinds of discriminations are going to wane out. This is an uncharacteristic condition of human being if the human being is aspiring to evolve. We should not allow this eclipse of what is called as discrimination in various fronts, right and wrong, vice and virtue, merit and demerit, the good and bad. So if we lose this discrimination, then it is going to prove doom. And that is why this sukhecha has been referred to as a klesha. Therefore, it is referred to as affliction. And Vyasa makes this clear in his comment. He says, if the vasana becomes strong, because desire for delights and pleasures and happiness is a vasana, is a tendency. If this tendency becomes stronger and stronger, that much it is going to eclipse. If the desire is not going to be so strong, that we will be little sane and will be discriminating. But if the desire, the vasana becomes very strong for happiness and delight and pleasure and sukham, then the aviveka is going to be rampantly there. The eclipsing will be there. And then the sukha sangha, sukhabhilasha will be rampant. And once it is rampant, then what is referred to as dushkrutya, it is going to be rampant. So it gives freedom, or it gives entry to dushkrutya. Dushkrutya means bad deeds, vicious deeds, unscrupulous deeds. So that is not going to have any reservations. And that is why if mankind is committing what is called as dushkrutya, bad deeds, it is because of the sukha vasana, sukhecha, sukha sangha. So for the sake of pleasure, man can even become a brute. Now you can understand why brutality is there. Brutality is there. One of the reasons for brutality is that there is an enormous sukhecha, enormous desire, vasana for having what one wants really, and which is object of happiness for someone. So for the sake of happiness, man has been committing brutalities. If you look at the history, now brutality is not at all expected and cherished and sought after, should not be sought after, it and is not sought after. But then if you have desire for happiness and delight, you will not be able to thwart it, you will not be able to restrain it. So sukhabhilasha, the tremendous desire for happiness, delight and pleasure and sukham, ends up oneself to be getting engaged into what is called as dushkrutya rather than sukrut. Sukrut is good deed, good act, good karma. And dushkrutya, dushkarma, these are all bad deeds. So the bad deeds get an open invitation just because of desire for happiness. So see how desire for happiness is devastating. Sukha is not devastating. Taking sukham, taking pleasure, taking delight is not devastating, but desire for sukham, which is invariable consequence of sukha experience, pleasurable experience, that is very devastating, and that is being referred to as klesha, and very, very truly it is klesha. So the man ends up in pashavi krutya. If man is committing brutal acts, one of the factors is that, although we know a factor is that man is cruel. Unless one is cruel, one will not be brutal. But that apart, there is also this sukhecha, sukhasanga, desire for happiness, itching for happiness, tendency to be happy, hankering to be happy, enormous desire or vasana for sukha. So sukha vasana also will be ending one to become a brute and engage in brutality. And this happens because of eclipse to vivekam. So now one can understand how it is a klesha. So now this brings us to understand why Patanjali has referred to raga as a klesha and sukhanushayi raga. That which follows the sukha experience, pleasurable experience, that attachment, that sanga, that desire, that aspiration, that yearning, that is a klesha. So it should be understood that Patanjali is not antagonizer of sukham, but the consequence of sukham that happens in human mind. So now sukha prapti, although man is going after sukham, sometimes karma vashat there is sukham. Karma vashat means as a destiny. The destiny is not always bad destiny and ill-fated destiny. There is also good-fated destiny. That is, happiness is in destiny. It is not that one needs to go after pleasures and therefore gets this attachment kind of afflictions. So even if one is not going after sukham, sukham will come his way. That's the aspect in scheme of destiny, scheme of prarabdha, scheme of karma. You may not be aspiring for pleasures, you may not be really desiring for pleasures, but pleasures will come your way. You may not be going towards pleasures, but the pleasures can walk unto you. And that is karma vashat sukha prapti. And then when you get pleasure that way even, not that you have sought after it and you have got it. You have not sought after that pleasure, but the pleasure will come to you. Because some pleasures are destined to come to you in the scheme of, in the plan of karma. So in that case again there is the chance and possibility of developing sukha sangha. Because you have to partake that pleasure which has walked to you, which has come to your doorsteps, which has come on its own accord. That is what is called as prarabdham. So prarabdha can also give you delight, happiness. The destiny plan also can give you delight and happiness. You will partake it. And when you partake it, that means you did not have desire, but yet it has come to you. And when it comes to you, then you start developing desire thereafter. So the klesha will come even that way. It becomes klesha. Sukhanubhava is also klesha in that sense. The sukha or delight that was not expected, but it came on its own. It walked up to your doorstep. Naturally, you took the pleasure of consuming the pleasure and happiness. And that was sukhanubhavam. Is also klesha. Now, there can be a question occurring to a human mind. It is like this, that superficially, with a peripheral view, the raga, there is no viparyaya. And we have been told that all these kleshas are viparyayatmaka. That is, there is illusion, there is imposition. Now, sukha might be absolute sukham for us, and more often it is that. Where is the false imposition, which avidya definition has impressed on our mind, convinced us that avidya is imposition. Now, is it right? Is it true that every time the pleasure must be pleasure out of imposition? We don't see any imposition, we don't see any illusion in all the pleasures and all the happinesses. There is no viparyaya, as it was impressed in the theory of avidya, that avidya is viparyayatmaka. It is of the nature of illusion. But where is the illusion in raga? So this is a question that would come to inquisitive mind, and it should come to inquisitive mind. If this doubt has not come, then you will have to doubt your fellowship. You will have to doubt your studentship. Anyway, point is, viparita jnana dharana is not evident in klesha such as raga. But if you see from where the pleasures engender, to whom the pleasures are there, why something is pleasure, then you will understand, you will identify the viparyaya there. Objectively, a pleasure is not any imposition. A sweet meat is sweet meat, chocolate is sweet, and chocolate is pleasure. Where is the imposition? You are trying to trace imposition or viparyaya or illusion in the objects. And that is why you get this question, that where is the imposition or false imposition in pleasure? Chocolate is a pleasure. Any sensual gratifying object, that object is a pleasurable object. Where is the illusion? It is not there that you should be tracing illusion or imposition. The sukha prabhavata, sukha prabhavatmikata, sukhajanyata, we getting the pleasure, there we have to cite illusion. We will find illusion there. See, there are objects of pleasures and there is subjective entity in getting pleasures. So if you try to trace illusion in pleasurable objects, then you will find it difficult to get it, trace it. And perhaps you will not find it, any illusion, any imposition. But you have to go towards subjective entity from where? Who gets the pleasure? Pleasure to whom? So klesha or the perversion or the illusion or imposition is in who gets the pleasure. Not what is pleasure as an object, but who gets the pleasure. Because pleasure is by pleasure sensation. If you don't have pleasure sensation, how will you get pleasure experience? You must have pleasure sensation. Who is going to get the pleasure sensation? You are going to get the pleasure sensation. You cannot get pleasure sensation means it's not a pleasure. You must get pleasure sensation. What is this you? This is the subjective entity. So, where do we see pleasures? We see pleasures in what is called as Aindrika pleasure, Aindriyaka sukha, Vaishayika sukha. When we trace the sukha in Vaishayika realm, then that is something which is fraught with imposition, falsity, viparyaya. So what is pleasure to senses becomes our pleasure. Now if you investigate into this, then you will slowly unravel how that viparyayatmakata or perversion or illusion or falsification or imposition is there. Now which is your pleasure, tell me? What is pleasurable to senses becomes your pleasure. Now, you are not your senses. You have senses. You are not senses. You are not sensory complex. You have a sensory complex. But with respect to pleasures, whatever is pleasure to senses become pleasure to us. Senses are not we. But pleasure of senses become our pleasure. So what is not our pleasure becomes our pleasure because senses are not us. Senses are not we. We have the senses. And their pleasure in turn becomes our pleasure. There is some kind of refraction by the time pleasure reaches the subjective entity. And that refraction gives you pleasure as pleasure. Refraction gives you pleasure as pleasure. And therefore there is that avidya component very much present there. Because you are imposing yourself on what you are not. So you identify yourself with the senses, which are actually your senses. They are for you. They are not you yourself. They are for you. And their pleasure becomes your pleasure. Now, is there no room for doubt here? So there you will get to understand that there is some kind of mix-up. There is some kind of underhand dealing. Because the senses, they get their pleasure and they make you feel that it is your pleasure. So, that is how we have to search the avidya component. Avidya is perversion. So therefore you will understand what is really not sukha is made to be taken as sukha by illusion, by delusion of senses. So delusion make you this. The senses give you this delusion that their pleasure is your pleasure, and therefore you seek the pleasure, and therefore you develop attachment for pleasure, and therefore you start acquiring pleasure more and more and more. And then philosophical investigation will tell you that that is actually sorrow. And here Patanjali helps us understand how that is a sorrow, because it is a klesha. So the klesha is becoming your happiness. Affliction is becoming your happiness. Resultantly, it is affliction, which we have just now seen that it gives rise to avivekam, it eclipses viveka, and we start doing what is really not to be done. We engage ourselves in all kinds of scams to attain the pleasure. So what do we don't do to acquire pleasures? So ultimate analysis will tell you what you took as pleasure is pain, because it is a klesha, it is affliction. Now affliction cannot be happiness. Your affliction cannot be your happiness. Your happiness, when it becomes affliction to you, that it bounds you to attachment, and then you start doing untoward things, you can trace that there is mal-identification. What is actually pain has been identified as pleasure, has been identified and taken as pleasure, consumed as pleasure, and then the after effects come up in the form of attachment, in the form of raga. That is a klesha. So we have to identify the klesha aspect which Patanjali is insisting, the klesha aspect in our sukha anubhava, and therefore we will be able to identify that there is actually avivekam. What is really dukkham is taken as sukha. If you look at the avidya sutra of Patanjali, anitya, shuchi, dukkha, anatmasu, sukha, nitya, shuchi, sukha, atmakhyati, avidya. So, sukha, dukkha, avivekam is aspect of avidya, integral aspect of avidya, core aspect of avidya. So that is identified here. That there is indiscrimination between dukkha and sukha, mal-identification in the form of dukkha taken as sukha, identifying sukha and in dukkha. So the avidya is very much there. When avidya is there, that means the perversion is there, perverse science is there, imposition is there, and indiscrimination is there, wrong identification is there, opposite identification is there. So that's how you can be even tracing klesha in raga. So that's how we have to psychoanalyze pleasure, pleasurable objects, instrument to get pleasure, and the subjective entity. So when we consider all this, object of pleasure, instrument through which we get the pleasures, and the subjective entity which gets pleasure. So if you start analyzing it, then you will realize that actually it is dukkham, and we are embracing it as sukha. We consider it as sukha. Therefore, the adhyatma and paramartha vichara will give this kind of wisdom to us. In adhyatma and in paramartha, what is spoken of is aihik, parlaukik sukha, and paramarthik sukha. Aihik paralaukik means terrestrial, celestial pleasures. These are relative pleasures. They are not absolute pleasures. They are actually, in fact, they are sorrows. Because they engender sorrow, they engender bondage, they endanger sufferance for us. They endanger by making us do untoward things, engage us in untoward things. Now, if you are engaged in untoward things, if you end up doing untoward things, then you know that there is a sorrow. It is sorrow. So, aihika parlaukika, that is, terrestrial and celestial pleasures, are in fact dukkham in philosophical point of view. Only there is something that is called as paramarthika sukham. Paramarthika sukham is absolute happiness. So then in Adhyatma we are told about Aindrika Sukha and to beware of Aindrika Sukha, not to indulge there. Vaisheka Sukha, not to indulge with Vaisheka Sukha. Vishayas, Shabda, Sparsha, Rupa, Rasa, Gandha. So their microscopic view will tell you that they are essentially dukkha. But then we identify them as sukha, we perceive sukha, which is illusion, which is imposition. We impose that it is pleasure and we partake the pleasure. And therefore, there is a classification which is called as prapanchika sukha, paramarthika sukha. So in Adhyatma you are introduced to this analysis and classification. One is aihika parlaukika, vaishayika, prapanchika, sukha, mundane pleasure. Mundane pleasure and even celestial transcended pleasure is also pleasure. But paramarthika, what is called as essential, quintessential happiness is only happiness. And where do you find that? Is only shown by Adhyatma, metaphysics. It divulges you what is essential happiness, where does it lie. So, therefore, philosophy gives us this wisdom and vision to discriminate between laukika sukham and paramarthika sukham, aindrika sukham and atindriya sukham, vishayananda and nirvishayananda, bhavatmaka sukham and abhavatmakam sukham. So the wisdom starts divulging us these things with better clarity. That is why it is called wisdom. So we have also dealt with the point that how there is avidya in raga, how there is perversion in raga, how there is perversience in raga, how there is false imposition in raga, how actually dukkha is taken to be sukha. So the avidya component is very much present, whereby it has been declared as klesha. And Patanjali very precisely says sukha anushayi ragaha, not sukha itself raga. He doesn't say sukha is raga, but what follows, and quite unexceptionally, immediately, is klesha. So don't think that Patanjali has a negativistic view, declaring pleasure as affliction, pleasure as klesha. No, pleasure is not described as klesha, but the consequence of pleasure, that is the human psyche. And the defect in human psyche is making it a klesha. And human psyche has this defect in the form of earlier klesha mentioned, asmita, aham tvam, mamatvam. I-ness and mine-ness. This I-ness and mine-ness, which is asmita form of avidya, is locus for sukham. If you don't have aham or mama or mamatvam, ahamtvam, mamatvam not in your psyche, then you will not be even identifying sukha vastu. You will not be going for sukha anubhava. It is the aham which gives you gravity to go after pleasures. This should be understood, that how asmita is also present in raga. We saw how avidya is present, but asmita is also a form of avidya, and then it is a preceding klesha to raga, and how that is also present. Because if you don't have the I-ness and mine-ness, then you will not be going for pleasure. We don't go after pleasure when we are fast asleep, because our I-ness is not there. Our I-ness is gone. It is gone temporarily. And because of lack of I-ness, even suppose that pleasurable things kept next to you on your bed, you don't wake up and grab those. Why? The objects are pleasurable. But the subjective entity that has to be present to identify the pleasurable object as pleasurable is not there in dreamless sleep. When you are fast asleep, all your pleasurable objects are kept next to you, yet your sleep is not revoked. Why? Because the object present, but the sensation of object is not there, because you are fast asleep. So understand that asmita, the I-ness has to be there. When the I-ness is there, then only you have the reception of experience, and even experience. There won't be experience without the I-ness. And if you don't have experience, then there is no pleasure. Despite the object at sight, you will not have pleasure. So see how asmita is also present, how avidya is also present. And in philosophy, we need to carry out inquiry and more in-depth study about these pairs, which I said as laukika sukha, paramarthika sukha, aindrika sukha, nirvisheya sukha, or vishayananda and nirvishayananda, bhavatmaka sukha and abhavatmaka sukha. This is also interesting category. See, when you are sad, with reasons that you would be sad, when your sadness goes, you don't just say that your sadness is gone. You say, now I am happy. You don't have any happy object to enjoy or to have intercourse with, but yet you declare your end of sadness itself as happiness. Now that is negative happiness. Our sorrows end, we say, now I am happy. It is actually a condition that only sorrows have gone. Going away of sorrow doesn't mean a positive happiness. But that is a negative happiness, and that too is happiness for us. We are happy with the fact that sorrows have gone. We are happy with the experience that the pain has gone. Now, going away of pain is not a happiness by itself, but there is also a category called negative happiness. So all these inquiries are part of chitta psychology, or chitta vignan, or chittology, or chaitik psychology. And all these are part of study of yoga. Now, we know that sorrows are sorrows. There is no doubt about sorrows not being sorrows. But what we are told here, that even sukham is sorrow. Why? Consequentially, there is sorrow in it. And therefore, sukham is also sorrow. So if the sorrows are sorrow and sukham is also sorrow, that means worldly sorrows, worldly pleasures are sorrows, mundane pleasures are sorrows, terrestrial, celestial pleasures are sorrows. And then comes a dictum that all is sorrows. All is sorrowful, all is sorrows. Because the pleasure of worldly kind or pleasure of terrestrial celestial plane, pleasure of senses, what we class as pleasure, that gets proved as sorrow. So sorrow itself is sorrow and pleasure also sorrow, therefore everything sorrowful is also a dictum that comes up here. Now, why there is sorrow in pleasure is worth investigating. Not so much identifying the sorrow in sorrows. We will not go into investigating why sorrow is sorrowful, but we will certainly be induced to investigate why pleasures are sorrows. And therefore, Patanjali has presented a wonderful analysis where we are given a education with regards to how Vaishayik Indriya pleasures, sensory pleasures, mundane pleasures, worldly pleasures, terrestrial celestial pleasures have sorrow. And that analysis is given by Patanjali in his sutra, which is 15th sutra of the second chapter, where he points out parinama dukkha, tapa dukkha, samskara dukkha, and gunavritti virodha dukkha. So Patanjali gives detailed analysis with regards to why the so-called sukham is dukkham. We don't need to investigate into how dukkham is dukkham and why dukkham is dukkham. But we certainly need some kind of enlightenment with regards to how sukham is dukkham, why sukham is dukkham, how much sukham is dukkham, in what context sukham is dukkham. Now this needs some enlightenment. And Patanjali gives this enlightenment by way of fourfold dukkham in sukham. Fourfold dukkham in sukham. What is fourfold? Parinama dukkha, tapa dukkha, samskara dukkha, gunavritti virodha dukkha. Object of pleasure is going to be a pleasurable object. But why it becomes dukkham for us? It is because human psyche, it is going to get experience of sukham, and its experience of sukham is fraught with avidya and asmita kleshas, and also raga as a klesha. Therefore, there is threefold klesha, threefold sorrow potential: avidya rupa klesha, asmita rupa klesha, and raga rupa klesha. So see how the klesha is escalating, because that was also one of the factors we considered in the enunciation to this topic. Avidya into avidya is asmita, asmita into asmita is raga, etc. So avidya into avidya, avidya into avidya into avidya. So this is the multiplication which happens in the klesha parva. So we have now landed up on the concept of parinama dukkha, tapa dukkha, samskara dukkha, and gunavritti virodha dukkha. So there we will get some enlightenment as to why there is dukkham in so-called sukham, dukkham in what is deemed as sukham. So we will be considering that, but that will be in our next session. Enough for the time being. Namaskar all of you.